Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to open the LSEC conference on deep learning and the brain. We are going to have 3 days of intense, stimulating discussions, formal and informal, about the fascinating topics at the intersection of AI, neuroscience, and cognitive sciences. I would like to thank the sponsors of the meeting, particularly LSEC, the Israeli Defense Ministry, Mafat, the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, and also the company Lightricks. I would also like to welcome visitors to the meeting from the US, DARPA, and the Office of Naval Research Global. I would like to thank my co-organizers, Daphna Weinschall, Daniel Lee, Andrew Sachs, for their hard work. I also would like to acknowledge our gratitude to LSEC staff who spent endless time and effort over the past 3 months or more to make sure that this event is a successful event. Please join me in thanking Alona Shani Narkis, Shani Shapira, Michal Lessi, Tomer Feinsinger, Nizar Abed, and last but not least, Nomi Kane White. Thank you. Now it's my great pleasure to invite the Rector of the Hebrew University, Professor Barak Medina, to welcome the audience.
Thank you, Chaim. Good morning. Welcome to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This gathering fulfills the vision of establishing this Edmond and the Lili Safra Center for Brain Sciences, the idea of a thick interaction between various disciplines to enhance our understanding of thinking. The separation of our academic activity into different fields of knowledge is, of course, essential for practical reasons, but it substantially limits the development of our knowledge, and our role as both scholars and administrators is to always challenge this separation and encourage interaction. The interaction that is at the heart of this gathering is a thick and substantial one in the sense of reciprocity. Occasionally, one field serves to obtain new knowledge in the other. This happens usually when the former field enjoys a stable paradigm, when we believe that we have already solved the central puzzles in one field, and the interdisciplinary study is aimed at to better understand questions in the other field. It seems that in the current context, both fields are still in the process of development. We still do not know enough how the human brain or biological brains more generally think, and we're still in the process of gathering a clear picture about the optimal way of machine learning. And it is in this sense that scholars from all relevant fields should benefit from this interaction. As a lawyer, outside of the relevant fields of this conference, I would not dare to offer substantive insights into the discussion. I would just make 2 small comments from the outside. First, it seems to me that the very idea of aiming to learn from one field to the other is, as of it itself, an interesting one. It is far from self-evident that biological thinking is optimal. We know that in important aspects, human thinking is inferior to machine learning, and it is thus an open question whether neuroscience is the right approach to make progress in deep learning. And at the same time, we know that the human brain is still superior to machine learning for instance, precisely because it lacks perfect recall and employs various heuristics, and it thus essential to better understand in what senses what seems as imperfections, as cognitive biases and limitations of biological thinking are in fact disadvantages given the different objectives of the two systems. And it might be the case that a man's preeminence above a machine, מותר האדם מן המכונה, is in its unique optimization problem that it aims to solve. A second brief comment is from my perspective as an administrator of a different type of machine aimed at producing knowledge, a university. And the question from my perspective is whether the fields of knowledge represented here can also offer insights about the optimal social constructs and institutions that are optimal for learning. And I will leave this question, and of course the question of the possibility of learning from social constructs, ones that were developed in a competitive evolutional process, are relevant for the discussion here. I will just conclude by admitting that I'm envy all of you here for the opportunity that you have to enjoy to contribute to fields that are still in their formative stage, when there are real new frontiers out there to explore. I'm grateful to the organizers of this important gathering, to Daphna, to Chaim, to Dan and Andrew, for taking the effort of making this conference happen. And of course, thank you all, our guests from abroad and from here in Jerusalem, for coming here to study deep learning and the brain. I'm sure that you'll all have fun here. Thank you.
Thank you, Barak. It reminds me that next time we organize a conference on this topic, we'll invite you to be co-organizers of the program, because we'll have also sessions about the brain and the law and ethics and perhaps philosophy as well. And next, I would like to invite Professor Israel Eli Nelkin, Director of LSEC, to welcome us.
Well, welcome. I welcomed you. So a little bit in more words, I'm really delighted to see the audience. Barak, Director of the Hebrew University. We might have here also the Director General, who will come to hear lectures out of scientific interest. The organizing committee, Chaim and Dan and Daphna and Andrew. And everyone else who, the people here that I observe really cover everything that we want. The biologists and the psychologists and the machine learners and the physicists, everyone is here in the audience. And this is exactly what LSEC is trying to achieve, this merging of the different fields that compose today brain sciences into something that is more than its, worth more than its individual parts. So one last word. We need to thank also the invisible caretakers. Chaim mentioned them, but I want to mention them again. Alona and Nomi and Shani and everyone else who is responsible on making this happen and happen successfully. They are here. The fact that they successfully did their job is because we don't feel them. We don't see them, we don't hear them. That's the sign of the success. So thank you very much. Alona is up there. Okay, Chaim?
Thank you, Eli. Before we begin the program, please note that there are going to be two interesting, hopefully also provocative discussion sessions. There will be one discussion session, the last item of today's afternoon session. It will be led by Dr. Sarah Caddick from London. The topic will be deep learning, biological plausibility. What does it mean? Where does it go? And the second discussion section will be towards the end of the program tomorrow afternoon. It will be led by Dan, and the topic will be industrial versus academic approaches to deep learning research. So please note in your calendar, in your plan, don't miss those events. And now I invite Eli to chair the first session.
Hello, everybody, can you hear? Microphone's on, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Chaim, and Daphne, and Dan, and Andrew. It's really cool to be here. I've never been in Israel before, so it's a great opportunity to come and visit and see all the interesting things that are going on. So that's very exciting. I'm going to talk about a couple of different things today. Given that we have a few extra minutes, we're starting a few minutes early, I think it might be great if people feel free to ask a few questions in the middle. So don't hold back. Even if I don't completely complete everything that I have to say, that's totally fine. So at the Stanford Neuro iLab, which is what I work at Stanford, we work on two basic reinforcing goals. One is the goal of using understanding brains and cognition to produce better AI techniques, and vice versa, using those techniques to give us better understanding and ability to parse brain data. So this is really challenging for me. So I'm going to take that off. Can everybody hear me from up there? Yeah, can everybody hear me from back there? Okay, great, that's better. So what that means in practice is that we work on two things. We build neural networks to solve challenging cognitive problems, and then use those networks to make quantitative predictions about high throughput brain data. So that's the practical meaning of this kind of reinforcing ideas. Today in particular, I'm going to talk about two types of work that we do. One of them is using deep neural networks as models of sensory cortex. And the other is approaching what I think is one of the most challenging problems facing us who compare and use neural networks to think about the brain today, which is approaches to make learning much more self-supervised, more like the way real systems learn. So I'll talk about both of those things. In starting to think about sensory cortex, the area that I work on most, and which is most familiar to a lot of people, is that of vision. And in visual object recognition, you're able to locate like what is where very efficiently and effectively. So it's sort of fast, accurate, domain general, tolerant to lots of variability. Some of you have seen this scene, those of you who spent time in Cambridge, but those of you who haven't may not have seen it before, and yet you're able to recognize all of these things almost instantaneously. And this problem is a really hard problem to solve from a computational point of view, because you need to do two things. You need to be selective, and you need to be tolerant. Selective to different objects, selective to different scenes, but, and able to tell when something is present or not, but tolerant to changes in the fact that, of course, these different objects will appear in many different ways in different images. Of course, doing any one of these things by itself is easy. It's easy to be selective. You just use a template to select out what you want. And it's easy to be tolerant by itself. You just integrate out the things you wish to be tolerant to. But the problem is when you need to do these two things together, it's quite challenging because in some ways they pull against each other. Okay, so this is the computational crux of a lot of entity extraction problems in real world data. And of course, vision is a great example of exactly this problem, right? And in fact, actually, vision is hard for two reasons. One, not only do you need to simultaneously be selective and tolerant, but you also need to be able to do it really fast and therefore presumably massively in parallel. Right? You see these things, and much faster than you can name them, you actually can recognize them. And as those images are entering your brain, some kind of processing that is able to be selective and tolerant is happening in this kind of extremely effective, extremely efficient fashion. Right? So for those of you who are familiar with the brain, you'll know about this, and for those who are not, just briefly, it's thought that this is kind of incredible selective tolerant visual processing is done in the primate visual system via a series of hierarchical convolutional areas in the primate visual system. So in particular, areas that are cortical areas like V1, V2, V4 that start early in the visual system, followed by areas in the temporal cortex that are later on. And in particular, you can see that in this diagram on the right, what we think of as flow of data through this system, in which data comes in at the retina and then goes through the areas of the system in a kind of sequence, so that by the time you get out to the top at the inferior temporal cortex, a lot of the challenging processing needing to support visual recognition has been done. So this picture can be sort of stylized into a series of representational areas whereby data comes in, and the neural representation in each area changes so that what was hard to read out early becomes possible to read out later. So this is where we think of as being object recognition in the later areas as being supported. And of course, this is happening fast in parallel, so that, again, when you look at these images, it's something like this processing is happening throughout the course of your visual system. So to show a quantification of this neural data in a really interesting way, I'm going to show you some data that we collected in conjunction with Ha Hong and Jim DiCarlo at MIT. In this data, multiple electrode arrays were implanted in macaque areas V4 and IT. So these are toward the top of this ventral pathway that I mentioned a moment ago. Were recorded in this data. And for about 6,000 images. So images of various three-dimensional objects, real-world objects like animals, boats, cars, chairs, faces, fruits, planes, and tables, on uncorrelated photographic backgrounds at various levels of variation. So in this case, low variation where the objects were head-on at a fixed position, pose, and size, medium variation, and then high variation where the objects are all over the image at many different sizes and whatever pose throughout the 360 rotation. And so this data basically is in the form of a matrix, because what you can do is you can take the spike counts of neurons recorded in these arrays, bin them in a time period after the sensory stimulus comes in this case 70 to 170 milliseconds, where the data is most present in those neurons, and then averaged over a bunch of repetitions to provide a neural data matrix, which is like neurons by images, so about 300 by 6,000. And what turns out to be really interesting is that you can use this data to do all sorts of recognition and estimation problems about the images. So interestingly, if you take neurons out of V4, those are in the intermediate area of the visual system, then while at low variation in a categorization problem such as this is 8-way basic categorization, animals versus boats versus cars versus chairs, et cetera, the performance is quite good in V4, but is much worse at high variation. So V4, even though it sees these images, is doing poorly. On the other hand, if you actually measure human performance on this actual same task, humans get a little bit worse at high variation, but they nonetheless maintain most of their performance power. In contrast to V4, IT, that is to say the data downstream of V4 in this sort of highest area of the ventral area system, is doing pretty well. It's retaining a lot of this performance at high variation. And at the time that some of this work was originally done, a lot of computer vision models were much worse than this still. Right? So there's this really interesting gap in performance that happens when the computations go from even intermediate to later areas. And that's really worth explaining from a computational perspective. So that was a problem that motivated me a lot, which was making predictive models of single neuron responses throughout the ventral stream to arbitrary image stimuli. And in doing so, it was sort of clear that convolutional neural networks were a good idea to begin with. There had been a lot of work already in using them to think about neuroscience, in particular in vision. So CNNs, lots of people have heard of them and know a lot about them in this audience, but what they do for our purposes is they condense rough neuroanatomy of the ventral stream, that is to say, the hierarchicality that I showed earlier, and the retinotopy, the fact that it appears that similar computations are repeated throughout the visual field, spatially tiled, in other words. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about convolutional neural networks in detail. People probably already know a lot about it. But I'll just briefly say that the individual layers of these CNNs, each single layer by itself, is itself composed of neurally plausible basic operations like filtering, linear filtering, and some non-linearities after that, such as thresholding, pooling, and perhaps normalization. These operations are applied convolutionally. This is a key point. That is to say, the same operations at each location, approximating the idea of retinotopy. And what the implication of that is that if you have an image-like input, the output is also image-like, with one of these gray slices for each linear filter that you have in your system, right? And so a sort of triumph in many ways of computational systems visual neuroscience was the realization that early visual areas such as V1 could be pretty well captured by shallow convolutional neural networks of the form of this one, sort of 1 or 2 layer such networks. And the key insight there is that the filters, or one key insight there, is that the filters of that network correspond to Gabor wavelets, or can be approximated in many ways by Gabor wavelets of different orientations and frequencies. Now, of course, where did that idea come from? I mean, in one way, it comes from people's intuition, Hubel and Wiesel's and other people's great intuition, that if you have the right fixed basis set, it just makes sense for computing interesting things about images, such as edge detection. Of course, there are other ways of capturing this as well that were really useful and quite startling when it was found, namely that if all you try to do is make a system represent its environment, but do so as efficiently as possible, such things will emerge naturally. So that principle of driven, sort of kind of low-level but goal-driven optimization was really interesting as well. So all of this exciting ideas suggested that if you were interested in thinking about things downstream in the visual system, so not in early visual areas, but in later visual areas, you might start to think about the same class of networks, but make them deeper. And that idea was sort of present from the beginning, since it's fairly obvious. That is to say, of course, you can stack such networks hierarchically to produce more complex operations, since the output is sort of image-like, and so you can keep going and make networks that are deeper. But there's a very substantial technical problem here, which is that huge number of parameters are consistent with this basic concept. Like you have to know, for example, all the discrete parameters or architectural parameters like the number of layers, the size of the receptive fields, et cetera, as well as the filter parameters themselves, right? So there's a big obvious question as to how do you find the right parameters to understand real cortex? And it turns out that it's really hard to generalize these basic ideas to much deeper multi-layer networks. So something else had to be done. One thing you could do is fit such a network to data. You could literally record the neurons in IT or something and then fit the whole network's parameters to that. And that makes a lot of sense intuitively, except that actually you don't have nothing like the amount of data you would need to do to actually fit such networks today and probably for a while. And so as a result, what ended up happening was dramatic overfitting. Right? You would work for a small number of images, but then it would fail on new stimuli that it hadn't seen, right? And so coming into this, we came up with trying to do a different idea, or we borrowed a very simple idea that had been used time and again, which was basically to optimize for some kind of larger problem or task that the system had to do. In fact, I told you earlier what that task was, the fact of doing object recognition from this system. And the idea was, okay, look, let's optimize the system to do object recognition, and then using that to fix what the nonlinear parameters were, ask how well did the internals of such a network compare to neural data? How well did they describe what the neural data said? So therefore, there's sort of two goals here. Performance goal, so accuracy on a challenging high variation visual task, and neural predictivity, so the ability of the model to predict each individual neural site's activity. And the hypothesis is that performance might drive us to have some amount of predictivity, and we wanted to know how much, okay? So then, of course, the question becomes how to actually do this optimization. And techniques for this have changed over time, but a few years ago when we did this, we did two things. One was optimize architectural parameters using automated metaparameter optimization, that is to find a kind of pseudo-evolutionary procedure to figure out an outer loop of what the discrete parameters were. And then in an inner loop, optimize the filter parameters using backpropagation. And in this case, in all cases, the goal was to solve the problem of minimizing the loss computed from large numbers of externally provided object category labels. That is to say, get better at the object categorization problem. There's many ways you could do this, many different data sets you could do this on, but one of the ones that was most effective was Imagenet. So this was a data set consisting of thousands of images in thousands of categories. Many people here have probably heard of it or worked with it. And so what we did was we trained our network on these real photos from Imagenet and then compared it to the stimuli that were used in our neural data set. And first of all, the question was, would it generalize, right? This was not obvious at the time. And in particular, we wanted to make this problem as challenging as possible, to be more real world-like, where we removed categories of photographs that appeared as in the test stimuli. So no animals or boats or cars or faces or fruits, et cetera. So we really wanted to ask about representational generalization. And what we found was that actually, indeed, this did generalize quite well. So over training time on this task, this is performance on categorization in this 8-way basic same categorization test that I mentioned earlier that the neurons were showed to be good at. So to put that in context, if this were the results that I showed you earlier, then this is where the model that was trained this way came when tested on that set. So it was able to fill in this gap between V4 and IT at high variation condition, a sort of hard, challenging condition that seemed to characterize where the neurons were able to make substantial transformations as you went down the visual system. And in particular, not only were the models good at a sort of single performance number, but they were also pretty good at tracking the pattern of performances across different tasks. So here what we're seeing is each dot is a task, and we're looking at neural decode performance versus human performance on each of these 100 tasks. IT is very highly consistent with human performance. V4 earlier is less so. The model is also highly consistent with human performance. In fact, both of these can't be, sorry, question. The x-axis here is D prime, so neural D prime. You basically train a decoder to try to, from feature basis, to solve this task, and then you compute the D prime to, so it's a measure in which 0 is essentially at chance, infinite is perfect performance, and humans on some of these easier tasks, humans and models are both at like 5 D prime roughly, whereas at tasks where humans and models are both bad, at roughly 0. These are tasks of different tasks with different particular object comparisons at different levels of variability. So these tasks are just chosen from a wide variety of tasks to ensure that you're spanning a wide variety to be able to even ask the question. Yeah. Well, because it's convolutional, in some sense it builds translation and variance in, right? Aside from that, nothing in particular is built in, except for by virtue of optimizing the networks to solve the task. If the task itself requires some amount of invariance, then presumably the networks learn how to be invariant in a sense. But aside from translation and variance, nothing is built in precisely. Okay, whatever needs to arise has to arise organically from simply solving the task. And what this says is that, okay, here where the task was something a little bit different, it was a different image set with a different categorization with different categories. But when you take the representation trained that way, not only is it pretty good at high-level performance at the sort of top performance number, but the patterns of errors that it makes are very similar to those made by neurons and by humans. Okay? So that's a sort of behavioral validation that the network is doing something somewhat reasonable. Okay? But an obvious question is, does it predict neurons better? Okay? So to see that, it's useful to represent the data this way. In this case, this is one particular unit in IT, and what we see is responses of this particular unit to thousands of images. This is not time, it's just thousands of images organized by category and by variation level within category. So this is a neuron that likes faces. This is a face neuron, probably from the middle face patch of the macaque. And what we see here is that the model predicts the neural responses pretty well. The red is the model and the black is the data. And the ups and downs of the model do a pretty good job of mimicking the ups and downs of the actual neuron itself. And that's not just true in that neuron that likes faces, but it's also true in neurons that like other things, like, I don't know, some IT neurons seem to like chairs, I guess. But most IT neurons are more like this, where they don't seem to particularly like any one category, but they have a clear pattern And that pattern is pretty well predicted by the neural responses of the model, okay? And this just gives you a sense of that not only was it true that across a whole variety, for several of the neurons I showed, but if you look at an average across all neurons, then the models produced in the way that I told you were a very substantial improvement over existing models at predicting neural responses. And in particular, performance on categorization across many models, in fact, thousands of models trained with different parameters, are highly correlated with the ability to predict neural responses in this highest visual area. Okay, question? Yeah, that's a good question. So I buried that in the detail since we could have a whole conference about how to actually compare neurons in a neural network, or units in a neural network, to neurons in real neurons. The thing that's being done here is basically a linear regression. So for every neuron in the brain, you try to find a small set of neurons in the model, a linear combination of which act like the neurons, the real neuron, right? Ideally, what we would do was we would know exactly how to transform any monkey's IT to any other monkey's IT, right? Because presumably it's not actually a one-to-one matching between two different monkeys, right? Presumably it's maybe many to one if you want to be able to actually construct any given neuron in one monkey from the neurons in the same brain area of the other. Whatever that transform is, that's what we'd like to use. What we actually use as a proxy for that, not knowing what the true transform is, we use linear transforms, okay? So they're fairly powerful enough to do a rotation, but not so powerful that they apply a nonlinearity. Okay, it's interesting to try to analyze where this result comes from. In particular, if you look at the early layers of the network that I just told you about, and you try to predict neural responses, what you find is that they're pretty good at handling parts of image space with little bits, with small amounts of variability in them. So in this case, low variation faces, where the faces are head on, right? You can handle that. But it's not good at being able to be selective while being tolerant to variability, okay? However, if you go up through the layers of this network, what you find is that by the time you get to the top of the system, it's much better at being both selective and tolerant at the same time, okay? And if you summarize that across all the neurons, what you see is that as you go up through the layers of this network, the top hidden layers are the best at predicting neural responses. Okay? And it's interesting to compare that to an ideal observer that has perfect access to information about the images, because it's not just being good at categorization that is by itself driving this ability. Because category ideal observers are actually much less good at predicting neural responses, although they are above chance in IT. But you sort of need to add the performance constraint together with actually being an architecture that takes stuff from pixels and operates something like this sort of neurally plausible class of hierarchical retinotopic networks to be able to get those two things together. Performance constraints and architectural constraints together give you this better neural predictor. But it's really interesting to then start taking apart intermediate layers. So this is the same type of visualization, but for neurons in V4, this intermediate visual area. I subsampled it here because it's a mess. I mean, in V4, it's really not categorical at all, so it's hard to see anything in particular in this type of visualization. And as it turns out, if you look at what's happening in early layers of such a network, they're not particularly good at predicting neurons in V4. And the same thing is true for the top hidden layers of such a network, also not particularly good. But interestingly, intermediate layers of the neural network are good at matching neural responses in V4. Okay? So to summarize, what that's saying is that the neural network trained for categorization has its peak predictivity for an intermediate area peaking in the intermediate layers of the model itself. Although the model wasn't even trained to do anything like match neural data, nonetheless its intermediate representations look like the neural responses in the intermediate visual areas. And in particular, you should notice that here the categorical ideal observers are basically a chance because V4 neurons are definitely not categorical. Summarizing what we've seen, predictivity goes up through the layers for IT, but peaks in the middle for V4. And actually, the same thing happens again at earlier layers. Right? So if you look at the filters that arise in such a network at early layers, what you see are things that look like Gabor wavelets, so the things that people observed and the actual neurons in that layer. And folks such as Nico Krieges-Korte, Marcel van Gerven, and others have found that if you look at the early layers of such a network, they're the best. That's where the peak arises for ability to predict data in early visual cortex of human fMRI data. Actually, work by folks including Andreas Tolias, Matthias Bethke, and Alexander, I think both Andreas and Matthias are here, have shown that such a network, such a kind of goal-driven HCN network, is actually a substantially better model of V1 than the best handcrafted model of V1. And so in particular, with high-resolution physiology data, what they're able to show us is that the peak predictivity in such a network comes in the early intermediate areas, kind of like where you might expect it to if this was the first cortical area in the system. And we've seen in similar networks that peak V4 is roughly here, peak IT is roughly here. Perhaps peak V2 would be here, and maybe even subcortical structures exist here, right? So, you know, of course, making these networks deeper and more varied has allowed us to parse the data a little bit more finely. So finding that in a sort of 12-layer convolutional organization, V4 is roughly at the 6th convolutional layer. Posterior IT is the layer after it. And central IT are the next several layers after that. And ideally what we would have is by combining data across all of these different sources, a kind of publicly available data validated version 0.1 model of the ventral pathway. Summarizing these results, what we see is that sort of complementing standard sort of from below approach of looking at what each area does and then moving on, a sort of top-down behavioral constraint can really allow us to make good predictions of neural responses and the structures throughout this sort of entire sensory cascade. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit from vision and talk a little bit about auditory cortex. So in work with folks at MIT, we started to think that it would be interesting to apply such ideas in auditory cortex because audition also has a lot of the same need to be sensitive and selective, but also tolerant. So you probably can't tell, but in this thing, what
Hannah
you hear
is good at compromising.
Is the signal. Hannah is good at compromising. And that's sort of invariant to speaker identity, background noise, reverberation in a room. You can still make out what's going on. And so kind of like visual cortex processes visual data, auditory cortex processes auditory data and into the ability to extract that type of information. And so we made computational models of the auditory system with this idea in mind, basically taking the waveform, doing a very simple coarse model of the cochlea to transform this into a frequency and time domain representation, and then apply convolutional networks on top of that sort of data with the idea of optimizing for a challenging auditory task and then comparing to neural data from that. And in particular, we worked with two tasks because we felt that there might be several things going on in auditory cortex. One was a word recognition task, a 600-way word recognition task with background noise. Another was a music genre task. And we asked ourselves, if we had architectures that allowed to do both tasks with potential branch points at different places, where would the optimal architecture be? And what we found after architectural metaparameter optimization was that the branch point would be sort of in the middle, and that different architectures would apply in different streams down there, post the sort of common early representation. And it turns out that this network is pretty good. In other words, it sort of approaches in its higher layers human performance on word recognition tasks in this very high background noise situation. But in particular, it was also a substantial improvement relative to existing auditory cortex models in terms of having its intermediate layers predict neural responses. What we see here is that in particular yellow is where this model that I just showed you was better than some of the existing best models, including a spectrotemporal model. And this is basically true everywhere. And maybe interestingly as well, early layers of the network that I just told you about were better explanations of primary auditory cortex, kind of where the system is thought to be doing simple computations, and later layers were better at predicting neural responses in higher areas of auditory cortex, really establishing that there was a computational principle underlying an auditory hierarchy that hadn't really fully been observed before. In particular, what we were able to do is pull apart regions of interest like frequency selective voxels in primary cortex, pitch selective voxels outside of primary auditory cortex, and music and speech selective voxels in different parts of the auditory processing by virtue of which pieces of the model responded best to those, and which stream was able to best capture the neural responses in those different areas. And so that allowed us to start to think that we could really start to pull apart this sort of high-level functional organization using models of this kind. In the future, we'd really like to do that in a more fine-grained way. But to sort of give you a sense of the overall picture, what's really interesting is that a very similar principle comes here as was in the visual situation, which is although the models that were used to obtain good performance have to be quite a bit different than the models used to obtain good performance in the visual case, nonetheless, there's this pretty strong correlation between performance on a task and ability of the system to predict neural responses throughout the auditory cortex. So kind of like, although the different models are quite different, the same principle holds in both cases. And to then sort of give you another example that we're really in the midst of right now and quite interested in, other animals, non-human animals, do lots of really interesting things with other kinds of sensory systems. So in this particular case, we're interested in making models of rodent whisker trigeminal system. So that is to say, perhaps thinking about how an animal that has whiskers can interact with objects in its world, shapes in its world, and figure out what those shapes are and learn to recognize them. And so here, the goal is to build task-optimized neural network architectures that do that and then compare to neural data. And there's a lot of interesting challenges here, like figuring out how to build the sensor, which is a much more complicated problem here than it is in the case of the sort of way that a pixel array represents a retina. But if you build an artificial whisker array, which we did, the 3D realistic 3D kinematic model of the whisker array using biophysical data, and produce an actual sensor, and then put that sensor, this is something going through the sensor, if you put that sensor onto the front of a variety of different architectures of neural networks that represent different hypotheses about how temporal and spatial information are integrated, what you find actually is that if you try to solve shape recognition tasks with all these different networks with that type of sensor, some of them do much better than others. In particular, recurrent networks with skips and feedbacks are very small and have very few parameters, but actually are very good at solving such tasks. Okay? And in fact, they make reasonable confusion patterns based on that. And so by virtue of having a sort of high-performing model shortlist, we can then start to ask how do they compare to neural data, which is the process we're in right now. So in particular, if we compute representational dissimilarity or cross-feature correlation matrices from such a thing and embed them in higher dimensional space, then we have different networks such as our feedback RNN or a time-then-space network, which first integrates time and then space, have quite different patterns of similarity, especially at intermediate layers. And in particular, their similarity is very similar across different initial conditions. So these different architectures are quite distinct and can be distinguished even at a high level of noise in the data measurement itself. So hopefully, as we gather data with Mitra Hartman, our colleague at Northwestern who makes recordings in these animals, we'll be able to put our neural data on this chart and see perhaps some of these networks are more like the data than others. And so that's an ongoing piece of work. But a sort of core question that arises out of all of these different tasks and different demonstrations in different systems is that it's probably useful to start thinking about analyzing such systems in a very different way. So it's not exactly this kind of understanding that comes out, right? We're not analyzing the filters that arise from this optimization procedure and finding sort of crystalline closed-form formulas for tuning curves, right? I think a better way to think about it is to think about it from a larger evolutionary perspective. So one of my favorite theoretical biologists, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Okay? Then there's another version of this, a little more specific and close to neuroscience, which is that nothing in neuroscience makes sense except in light of behavior. And this is from Gordon Shepherd. So in many ways, the reformulation is that the sort of brain's evolutionary age can be proxied to some extent by performance on a cognitive task, say, such as categorization, right? So the way I think about the type of understanding that arises here is that what we've done is formulate a comprehensive model class, in this case CNNs. Each dot in this sort of large circle is a different model. We choose a challenging ethologically valid task that sort of cuts out for different tasks like categorization or word recognition, a subset of these structures, And then we implement a generic learning rule that tells us how to get to that subset, right? It's sort of modeling a kind of evolutionary and developmental procedure. And then once you've done that, then you can map the brain data. So in this case, CNNs with categorization mapped to temporal averages of data in the ventral stream, right? And of course you could do that with different models optimized for different tasks to look at different areas of the brain, right? That's a pretty simple idea when you think about it. And as what we've shown you so far is that similar ideas can maybe have utility both across a whole variety of different sensory systems and in fact different species. So there's like sort of three elements to this goal-driven modeling approach. One of them is convolutional, is specifying an architecture class, another is specifying a task, and a third thing is specifying a learning rule. Okay, so in what I've talked to you about so far, we looked at mostly temporal averages of responses. So in this case, in the visual case, bin spike counts in the sort of 70 to 170 milliseconds post-stimulus presentation. And that's fine as far as it goes, but actually the data is highly reliable at a much finer grain. And indeed, there's lots of dynamics. Underlying those dynamics is probably some form of recurrence, right? So everything I've talked about, all the models are feed-forward. Many of them are. But in the visual system, there's lots of recurrence. So local recurrence within areas and long-range connection recurrence, long-range feedback between areas, right? And in fact, these dynamics are very likely to be behaviorally relevant. So for example, if you look at late dynamics of responses to faces, then responses to normal faces drops off late in the neural response, but responses to atypical faces, which are highly surprising, the response stays up for longer, suggesting that perhaps the late response is telling you something about the surprise you feel when you see this face. Or similarly, hard images, that is to say ones that are harder for neural networks to solve, tend to be decoded later out of neural responses than easier images, suggesting some kind of dynamics is computing something, right? So what that means is that we're motivated to go from thinking about conv nets with categorization and temporal averages in the ventral stream to convolutional RNNs, and then map those to ventral stream dynamics. Of course, what the task should be is interesting, but that can be chosen in a variety of ways. And so I'll briefly tell you about some work with colleagues at MIT and Columbia to build such networks. So basically, conv-RNNs are like convolutional networks, but with the ability to have local recurrent circuits within an area and long-range feedbacks between those areas. It turns out that actually standard ways of adding parameters through recurrence help a little bit in terms of performance, but not too much. So if this is a feed-forward network, and this is a feed-forward network that's twice as deep, this is substantially better. The deeper network is substantially better at performance. If you take a simple RNN, that is with no particular internal structure, and you add that at each layer, you do get better. But it's actually not much better than its control where you run the data through the network once. So this is a good parameter-based control. You only get a little boost over having networks of the same number of parameters. And actually, if instead of using simple RNNs, you use the standard short-term memory, LSTM, a similar thing occurs. It's actually a lot more parameters, but you only get a little boost out of using those parameters compared to the parameter control. Okay? But it turns out that if you use something somewhat better recurrent structures, you can do quite a bit better. So in particular, there are two basic principles of recurrence that seem to be really important in a visual system and adding these structures to the visual system. One of those is gating, that is to say multiplication by input-dependent tensors with values in 0, 1, and the other is bypassing, which is basically the idea is when the recurrent cell is in its 0 state, the input should be unchanged. So simple RNNs have property 2. They do bypassing fine, but not 1. They're not gating. Whereas standard LSTMs have property 1. That is to say they gate. That's in fact the basic thing they do. But they're not good at bypassing. They actually change the signal when the data is when the cell is its 0 state. What you really want are cells that have both of these. And we've designed a variety of these cells by hand that had these properties. And in particular, then just looked at creating a large space of RNN structures that have both of these properties. And again, to try to do a kind of evolutionary procedure to discover which parts of this structure matter. And as you do this, it turns out that having both of those properties matter a lot. And these red lines are the ones that are highly selected for in the search. And having done so, what it turns out is that the cells that come out of that process not only are almost as good as the much deeper network, but with almost not many more parameters. In particular, about an equal number of parameters to the feed-forward network, but much higher performance. They're also much better relative to their specific parameter control. And they're also able to handle using deep feedback from higher layers to early layers to improve performance still. So basically what I've told you here is that we did the same thing we did earlier in some high-level way, optimized the structure, but now in a much wider architecture class with recurrence locally and globally to solve a task. And then the question was, how well would it do at predicting neural dynamics? So that, in other words, now the task is fix the linear transform from the neurons at one time point, and then ask, how do the inherent dynamics of the network predict the actual inherent dynamics of the neurons at all the other time points? As it turns out, networks with this recurrent structure are substantially better predictors of neural dynamics than networks of various other kinds with different structures, or with the feed-forward networks that can't predict the complex dynamics that must be generated by some form of recurrence. What here is basically saying is that a similar idea to that previously described was pretty good at being able to capture this much wider class of phenomenon in this domain, in particular neural response dynamics. Of course, we worked with categorization tasks similar to what we did in the case of the feed-forward networks, but just found that trying to solve those static tasks with a recurrent network led to predictions of neural responses in the case of neurons seeing static images, and yet they have quite a bit of dynamical responses. But it'll be really interesting to see what happens if we do really different tasks, dynamic tasks going forward. In particular, maybe other meta tasks, such as a time accuracy trade-off where you're trying to be correct but also fast at it. Interestingly, we'd really like to see how these dynamics help us understand the learning rule in the long run. Sort of to summarize this first part, and basically since I'm close to being out of time, I'll only have time to mostly go into detail here. But what I've told you about is using neural networks as models of sensory cortex, in particular modeling primate visual cortex, human auditory cortex, rodent somatosensory cortex, and in particular looking at neural dynamics as well as static neural responses. In the last few minutes, I'm going to try to just briefly talk about some of our sort of neurocognitive approaches to self-supervised learning. I mentioned these three ingredients: architecture class, task, and learning rule. And in the case of the visual context, I think our approach to the architecture class is kind of okay. It's not perfect, certainly, but in the context of convar and ends, I feel like we've sort of done a reasonable job capturing most of the high-level architecture of what might be there. But there's an obvious fundamental problem in our task, right? Which is that there's just no way that any of these kinds of organisms receive millions of high-level semantic labels during learning, right? That's just an obviously broken, huge problem. Question? 5 minutes, okay, great. Obviously broken, huge problem in this whole approach. It's an effective proxy, perhaps, for making networks that look something like the adult state of these systems, but sort of just obviously deeply wrong approach to thinking about learning. It's a major motivation of my work going forward to try to come up with some kind of semi or self or unsupervised loss function that's realistically costly to the creature but is sufficiently powerful that it constructs useful representations. And so I could talk about this for a bit, but what I will say, let me just jump to a piece downstream a little bit, which is where I think this direction is going in a very interesting direction. So. Unfortunately, so I mentioned earlier that autoencoders have some power, right? They are able to give you structures that look like they produce early visual cortical areas pretty well. But they seem to be challenging to use to get stronger representations. Even the fanciest existing recent autoencoders, although they're very good at some very exciting things, tend not to produce representations that are good for categorization tasks or that look like neurons, at least to the extent we've been able to evaluate it. But it does make sense to think of perhaps dynamics as giving a richer signal. So that's something like a temporal autoencoder, where the goal is to predict a later state from an earlier state with perhaps some penalty. But a problem is that most passive video sequences are actually quite boring and lead to fairly trivial features. If you apply sort of standard video prediction, you typically get structures that are not as effective as one might like, although maybe we'll hear something cool from Rob Fergus on this tomorrow. In particular, what this suggests, at least suggests to me, was that we should look through systems that actually do some kind of interaction with their world. So not only do they passively observe video, but they actually create interesting actions on top of that. And particularly children are really great examples of this. And so what that means from my point of view is trying to allow systems to be agents that take actions and then solve a kind of action-dependent temporal encoding process. But of course, if you just formulate it this way, the system will be trivial because it will be lazy. You know, if you give it the freedom to take whatever actions it wants, it will look at the floor, which will zero out this state, right? So you really need to add something on top of exactly this formulation to get something that really does anything. And in particular, the general idea here is to add another term in the loss function that encodes a kind of intrinsic motivation. Okay? That is to say, a little bit of a kind of, quote, curiosity should be added to the agent to get it to do something in this formulation. So what we've done is build agent-based models that have a kind of perception piece, as well as act back on the environment, and in particular, try to solve a world model recognition problem, in this case something like a future prediction problem, but not only do so with the actions generated by the world, but also decide what actions to do by learning a self-model, and in particular a self-model that predicts the errors of the world model. And by building a curiosity principle into this, that is basically one in which the agent is forced to take actions that the world model doesn't yet fully understand. In other words, it should go after actions that are hard for its own world model to do. The idea is that there should be a sort of virtuous cycle whereby the curiosity leads the agent to get better world models, which in turn lead the world models to make more informed choices about what's interesting. Okay, and in some recent work that was in this most recent NIPS, we've built a version of very simple and sort of proof of concept version of this using a baby agent that can swivel its head, can move around a room and apply forces to objects and receive back images of what it's done. And in particular, implemented the sort of self and world model as neural networks that are antagonistic to each other in terms of the world model's attempt to predict the future, the self model's attempt to predict the agent's own error landscape, and then adversarially choose actions to make the world model challenged. And it turns out that if you do this, a number of very interesting behaviors emerge. So first of all, the agent learns to understand its own ego motion. Once it gets bored with that, it starts to look at objects, not because any concept of object is built in, but simply because objects are more fun to play with by this virtue. In other words, they're harder to predict the responses of. And then, when they learn about objects, are able to actually have very advanced predictor abilities in terms of noticing where the object is and its ability to categorize the visual context that it's seeing. Also, some sort of simple navigation and planning behaviors emerge, since in particular, if the object is not in view, the agent turns to find one. If the object's too far to touch, the agent goes toward it. And then once it's close to an object, it stays close and plays with it until it learns a lot about it. And in particular, if you have many objects in the room, the agent will first recapitulate behaviors with a single object, but then after it gets bored with playing with a single object, will bring many objects together and whack them, much like a baby does, and learn a lot from that. Essentially, I don't know how else to describe it, but that whacking procedure. And it turns out that if you do this, the ability of the system not only to generate interesting behaviors emerges, but also the representations learned that by get substantially better at recognizing the objects, even though no labels of any kind were used to do so. And when there's a lot of interactive capacity, the ability to do recognition goes up even compared to, say, situations with simple single objects. So we're really interested in producing and pushing this much further, and in particular, replacing a lot of the sort of simpler kind of initial versions of what we've done with more sophisticated pictures of object dynamics and intuitive physics. Fortunately, I don't have time to talk about this approach that we have to thinking about three-dimensional representations of physical objects and how to model physical dynamics using the using neural networks that are sort of advanced versions of what we've built earlier. But in particular, what I would like to leave you with is the idea that we can think of this initial sort of ventral pathway as a kind of extractor of features, and then use those features to make much more interesting predictions for physical interactions between objects, and use those as a basis of a latent space for self-supervised learning. You know, as we work on this sort of idea, we're not only interested in building the AI underneath this, but also using these to make predictions for both developmental studies in children and also in neural data, and they're doing that with colleagues at Stanford and MIT and elsewhere. So I've told you in fair detail about this first thing. I've glossed over a lot of details, but mentioned some interesting things about what I think that the bigger holes are. But as a whole, I think that, you know, where we're really trying to go is towards making a model of this. So thanks, and happy to take some questions.